Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today we'll be talking about a subject that I'm particularly passionate about. When we play old works on the piano, we must usually rely upon a modern edition of these works in order to learn the score. There are many different editions and editors that present essentially the same information, and as with any variation of a single subject, there may be brilliant editions and horrible ones. Outside of this realm exists the facsimile. This usually takes the form of a photographic copy of an original manuscript or first edition. Normally, these are usually only interesting from an academic or aesthetic point of view, but occasionally they can inform us beyond modern editions when it comes to practical performance. This episode is going to focus on a particular musical case, which for many years was something of a mystery to me, only to be eventually solved by careful study of the original manuscript of the piece of music, gifted to me in facsimile format. Mozart's piano concerti are, for the most part, formulaic when it comes to structure. He rarely deviates from the three-movement format, and within these movements, once again he tends to follow what could be called a stylistic pattern. One event that always occurs in the first movement of a Mozart concerto is the building of a rather large cadence that ends the first section, the exposition, of the movement, heralded by a long cadential trill that leads to the orchestra taking over. Here's an example of this from his concerto in B-flat major, K450. This situation of a cadential build-up is repeated later on in the movement, just before the main cadenza. This build-up before the trill is very common in this style of music, and it is characterized usually by a series of scales or arpeggios that emphasize the harmonic changes that lead to the trill. Now, let's have a look at the C minor concerto K491. Mozart uses the same device at the end of the exposition in the first movement, but notice what happens to the scales, or what doesn't happen. He repeats this cadential device at the end of the movement before the main cadenza. Again, pay attention to the arpeggios and what they lead to. As you may have noticed, in the C minor concerto we have a very odd situation in the score. In both cases in this movement, Mozart begins a musical pattern and then drops it entirely before the trill, writing only single notes. The first time, he starts with a scale pattern. And then he drops it. The second time, he starts with an arpeggiated figure. Then he drops it again. Was this really intentional? This question actually requires a little background information. When it comes to accuracy of the text, Mozart is one of the few composers upon which we can rely solely on his autograph manuscripts. Unlike the music from his operas, he was not known to revise or revisit his piano music much at all, which means that we don't have competing versions of his musical text to edit and consider. Unlike Chopin, there is usually only one version of a particular Mozart piano piece, and given how clean his manuscripts are, there's not much to debate regarding notes or accidentals, or even slurs and articulation markings. What this means practically is that it is very possible to learn Mozart's piano works directly from the manuscript, without the fear that he may have changed the music later on in a published edition, or revised the score and had it republished as a new version. But this also means that when we see things which seem rather odd at first, our instinct may initially kick in to ask the question, what in the world was Mozart thinking? As a matter of interest, I noticed that there are several published recordings available in which the performers, given the material they have, try to make the best of these single notes. Sometimes it takes the form of exaggerated movements, like this. And sometimes it's done in a way that seems rather shy or apologetic, like this. But in these cases, the artists are left to try to make sense of something that musically doesn't make sense at all. In other concerti, Mozart starts a pattern and continues or alters it, building to the cadence without interruption. The disappearance in the C minor concerto doesn't appear to be something that is quirky or on purpose. It seems like something is simply missing. It's only when I encountered the manuscript that I suddenly understood why these notes are the way they are. Let's have a look and compare the scores. Here's a modern edition of the music as a full score. Here, you can see what Mozart wrote according to the modern edition, which could be self-described as a kind of urtext edition. Here's the musical pattern, and here's where it drops out to single notes. Now, what does the original manuscript look like at this point? Here we are. As you can see, Mozart does in fact start the pattern in the right hand. And then he simply drops it later on. So, technically, the modern edition is representing exactly what Mozart wrote in the score. To answer the question of, is this really intentional, it seems like it is so. But let's look at the facsimile a little closer. Look how much space Mozart has to write the scales. Furthermore, he's already crossed out a version and replaced it above with another. Now, if I were trying to fit in all these notes into a tiny bar the way Mozart was, and if I knew that these notes were really only for me, because I'd be the one performing it, I'd probably do what Mozart eventually did. Write an indicator for the first two scales, and then leave the outer markers for the third. In this way, he sets up the pattern, and then saves himself the trouble of trying to write the rest of it, since it can follow in a logical manner. The second build-up is written in the same way. Here's how it looks in the modern edition. And here's what it looks like in the facsimile. Now bear with me because we have to do a little page turn here. Here are the first arpeggios, and then he cuts it out and just writes the extended notes. Now, in this facsimile, the first two patterns are reasonably clear, and then he just doesn't bother to fill in the rest. Now, this kind of comparison between facsimile and modern edition is interesting just for the accuracy's sake alone. However, the facsimile of the manuscript here actually indicates something much more than just editorial attention to detail. Here's what I think happened. Mozart did not necessarily write his scores in a logical order. In other words, sometimes he might fill out the piano parts first, sometimes he might fill out the violin or clarinet parts first, and sometimes he'd write certain interesting ideas over a figured bass line to be filled in later. This manuscript hints at the possibility that Mozart was not only writing in a hurry, as can be seen by the numerous examples of crossing out and correcting notes and gestures, but that he wrote the piano part last. Considering that Mozart premiered most of his concerti, it's not too far-fetched to assume that he wrote the orchestral parts first so that he could double-check the individual instrument parts that the orchestral members were using, and that the piano part was left unwritten, as he would have known in his head what he was going to play as a soloist anyway. Whatever reason he had for writing down the piano part, he was left in an unfortunate bind when he got down to it, because the space within the bars that were completely adequate for his orchestral needs turned out to be far too small for the needs of the piano solo. There's a wonderful example of this at the end of the first movement. The fourth bar from the end shows what happens when there's simply not enough space to write, but Mozart needs to clarify what he wants to have happen. So instead of trying to fit it in, which clearly failed on the first attempt, Mozart simply rewrites the bar after the piece is done, with an indication of where to fit it in. The interesting thing about this is that he chooses to make this concession here, but he does not do the same with the earlier scales and arpeggios that we were dealing with. This opens up the possibility that Mozart would have improvised at these points of empty bars, with the long notes functioning as the pitch limits of whatever improvisation he could come up with. This means that we could also do the same. So, what do we do? Well, I'll show you how I approach it, but it's by no means the only solution. First, I'm convinced that the open solitary notes are not the end result of Mozart, but merely a framework which borders what we choose to do. A very simple but effective approach to this framework could result in us following the scale pattern that Mozart sets out, improvising within the harmony and top-bottom pitches. Now, we can also be a little more daring, and do something which Mozart has done in the past. Play the scale, and then rhythmically alter it a little just before the cadenza. Similarly, with the second section, we're starting on arpeggiated chords, so why not follow that with the long notes as borders? Once again, we can play around with this a little, and do some arpeggios followed by a different gesture on the way to the trill. Technically, this is a very conservative solution to the problem. The idea behind it is that we make it sound like Mozart didn't leave anything out. Facsimiles can teach us many things, and they are invaluable in terms of study. If you don't own any yourself, I highly recommend accessing and studying them at a library, or even digitally online. There are some editions of music that come with a full facsimile of the piece alongside, which is an added bonus if the original is difficult to obtain or out of print. But you absolutely have to do your research on a piece before you base any of your decisions solely on the facsimile. With Mozart, a facsimile represents perhaps the most immediate and accurate representation of his music, whereas with Beethoven, it can be an editorial nightmare due to his numerous corrections for his first editions, and things like added bars or notes, which are not present in his manuscripts, but were approved by him for the printed versions for sale. With Chopin, facsimiles are interesting but problematic, as he often committed more than one version of a single piece to paper, and thus left us with differing options, which editors continue to squabble over today. You have to be careful. So, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing, and have a look, if you can, at some facsimiles. You may be surprised at what you can find. Bye for now.